When you play the Game of Thrones,
Subscribe and like.
you die. There is no middle ground.
All right, welcome back to the Grease Comedy YouTube channel. Today's video, we are going to be doing Catelyn 1, A Clash of Kings. And it's kind of crazy to me that Catelyn kind of starts out this late in the book. Given we're already on page 81, this is the first Catelyn chapter. Given that in the first book, outside of Ned and Daenerys, she was one of the main leads of book 1, she gets a little sidelined, I would say, to start out this book a little bit. But it's a really good chapter that she has. And I think one thing that I think a lot of the chapters that start this book and even the last book that kind of had issues with is this idea of introducing or reintroducing the plot line of that character or characters, and then also, trying to forward the plot. So, for instance, one of my biggest criticisms with the Bran chapter that we did was it didn't really forward the plot at all. It was almost just a complete reintroduction into Bran. And so I really like Catelyn's first chapter in A Clash of Kings because I think it balances both of those things pretty well. And also, I did want to give a shout out to my Spotify listeners. If you did want to listen to these on Spotify, I do put them up at the same time that these videos go live. So if you did want to listen, on the road or whatever, you can always do that. The link will always be in the description. But let's get into page 81 of A Catelyn 1, A Clash of Kings. Robb Stark's crown has been freshly forged and heavy on his head. He seems to be someone that is not used to it at all. As somebody who is basically cosplaying as Robb Stark for Halloween, I have a crown that is getting 3D printed and it feels extremely weird to have on my head. So I can only imagine that with an actual metal crown and how uncomfortable that would be, but it's kind of meant to be that way. It's kind of this symbolism. Crowns should never be, easy to wear, or sitting on the Iron Throne should not be a comfortable thing. It should mean that you're responsible for a lot of people, that you need to protect people and take your role as king seriously. But Catelyn thinks about how the original crown of the Stark kings, made of bronze and iron, was lost 300 years ago when Torrhen Stark submitted to Aegon the Conqueror. And there is no real indication of what happened to that crown. Did Aegon have it melted down? What did he do with it? We just don't really know at this point, and Fire and Blood didn't really give us any clarification into that either. But the new crown that Robb had was crafted by Lord Hoster's smiths, resembling the old one, a bronze circlet with runes of the first men toppled with 9 black iron spikes, shaped like swords. And so the main thing that really, pops up right away is this crown is kind of dull. It's not exactly flamboyant. If you think about Renly's crown and how the show did it, or you think about Joffrey's crown, very flamboyant crowns. Even the Targaryen crowns, they're very stand out with, rubies and all this stuff. Robb's crown is very simple. It's supposed to represent kind of the values of the men of the North. As Robb waits in Riverrun's Great Hall, he keeps adjusting the crown. Like I talked about earlier, it just doesn't seem to be comfortable for him at this time. But when the prisoner is brought in, Robb asks for his sword, which Oliver Frey hands to him. And once again, it kind of goes back to that callback that book 1 had, right? That somebody, when they bear a sword, should really mean it. A lot of ways of showing immaturity and insecurity in book 1 was by doing this. We saw Viserys, Joffrey, Robb, Jon, all those characters did that in book 1. And so this is a bit different because Robb actually does have intentions of using that sword. He's been through multiple battles now at this time, and he is basically trying to show his power over Cleos Frey to, again, get these peace terms to be accepted. Robb then draws his sword and rests it across his knee, again showing his authority and power. And Sir Robin Ryger, captain of the Tully Guard, announces the prisoner to Robb. And that's going to get us into page 82. Theon Greyjoy orders Sir Cleos Frey to kneel before Robb Stark, and Sir Robin Ryger forces him to comply. It's not the most honorable way of handling prisoners, but I guess you got to get the point across. Put a little bit of the fear of the old gods into Cleos. Catelyn Stark observes Sir Cleos, and she knows that he really doesn't look anything like a Lannister. He looks more like the Freys. He doesn't have kind of the blonde or golden curls of, say, Jaime Lannister and Cersei. He doesn't really seem to have the face and the good looks of the Lannisters. He seems to have more of the Frey features, with stringy brown hair and a thin face. Robb tells Sir Cleos to rise, his voice a bit of maturity beyond maybe his years and kind of shaped by war. She doesn't think it is, like Ned's voice, for instance, where Ned could be very cool and icy. You think about his interaction with Robert and Cersei at the Crossroad Inns and the issue with, Joffrey getting bit by Nymeria. He doesn't have that voice to him, but he definitely seems like he's aged a bit, right? He's not the same young kid that he was at the beginning of A Game of Thrones. And Sir Cleo seems very anxious, and I would as well. If you think about this, Robb has a sword basically on his knee, basically threatening you. You have all these other lords that don't like you. You're not being treated the best. And not to mention, the real thing that puts him on edge, as Catelyn thinks, is the presence of Greywind next to Robb. And I want you guys to remember, as we go forward in this story, Robb and Greywind's relationship does not seem to be as strong as it is here, where Greywind is always with Robb. If you think about by the time we get to A Storm of Swords with the Red Wedding, this is something that's obviously a sign of bad things to come that Catelyn points out. But if you think about Greywind as well, from Cleos, he had been fighting for the other side, right? Even fighting for the Lannisters. He would have seen probably, or at least heard the stories of what Greywind did to men in battle. Sir Cleos nervously scrambles up, causing some men to laugh in the hall because of Greywind, and he mistakenly addresses Robb as my lord instead of your grace. And Lord Umber is not going to let that fly. He was the first one that named Robb king in the north, and he corrects Sir Cleos, reminding him that Robb is a king. And Catelyn even thinks even more into this Cleos Frey. He seems to be someone that even personality-wise is much more like a Frey, a bit more timid, more like a Frey than a Lannister. And she even reflects how differently someone like Jaime would react. Jaime is somebody that would be, especially at this point in the book where we don't know his true backstory, he's somebody a bit more arrogant. He wouldn't be kind of beat down into submission, kind of like how Cleos has. But as we go on, Robb informs Sir Cleos that he will deliver a message to Queen Cersei Lannister in King's Landing under a peace banner with an escort of 30 men. Now, this is what I find is fascinating, because if you think about where we left the storyline off in Book 1, there seemed like Robb in the North and the Riverlands were not going to sue for peace whatsoever, right? That's something that Catelyn was really pushing hard for, and she was getting shut down in Book 1. And so it right away raises that question is, why is Robb, offering peace terms? How did this come to pass between Book 1 and Book 2? And we'll kind of figure that out in this chapter. But Robb also clarifies, although he is giving Cleos Frey an opportunity to go to King's Landing and deliver the terms, that doesn't mean that he is free. Cleos Frey is still a prisoner of war until he is freed, whether they lose or win the war. As even though, again, Cleos is a Frey, and the Freys are backing Robb at the moment, Cleos Frey had more ties to the Lannisters and fought to the Lannisters. If you think about his mother is a Lannister, even though his father is Frey. It's also going to just kind of subtly remind you that the Freys do have ties to the Lannisters. Robb demands a pledge from Sir Cleos on his honor as a knight that after delivering the message, he will return with the Queen's reply and resume his captivity. And Sir Cleos Frey is kind of put in a really bad spot here. If he was ever going to break this, and I think the temptation would be there, right? Like, think about the way he's been treated already. He's been forced to his knees, openly mocked and humiliated by Robb's camp. Temptation would be there to just, once you get to King's Landing, just stay there, right? There's nobody there that's going to be able to stop you, but would your pride and would your ego, let you sleep at night in terms of, how you abandoned this vow and all those things? But Sir Cleos Frey is maybe not that type of person, as he vows to return after delivering Robb Stark's message to Queen Cersei. Edmure Tully then warns Sir Cleos that the entire realm will know if he breaks his vow. And this seems to make Sir Cleos a bit uncomfortable, but he does agree and asks what the message is. Robb, standing with his sword in hand and Greywind by his side, announces an offer of peace to Cersei, which is going to be very controversial. Think about what Stevron Frey in Book 1 proposed, or think about what Catelyn proposed, that they should try and, sue some sort of ceasefire or, a peace with the Lannisters and let things kind of play out. Robb is kind of teetering there, and so some people are not going to be happy by that, as we're going to see, because after he declares this, Catelyn notices the tenseness, and she even sees Lord Rickard Karstark leaving the hall. But Robb remains focused, and this is just a little bit of foreshadowing as to what is to come. Lord Karstark has lost family and sons because of this war, and he wants vengeance on the Lannisters. And even Robb himself also kind of harbors some of that hatred and all that stuff for the Lannisters because Ned died in the last book. But it seems like Robb is able to at least set a little bit of his pride aside to give peace terms. Now, I'm going to talk about the peace terms, but I don't think they're necessarily good, and Catelyn also agrees on that later on, but his peace terms are quite interesting. So Robb then commands Oliver to give him a parchment, which he reads aloud, listing these terms. So the first term is the release of his sisters, Sansa and Arya, with safe passage from King's Landing to White Harbor. Sansa's betrothal to Joffrey Baratheon then also being ended. And the first term makes a lot of sense, right? Get your family back. I feel like that's a very reasonable request. The second term is the return of Lord Eddard Stark's bones to Winterfell, along with the remains of his household guard who died in service. Once again, I would say it's a pretty reasonable term. The third term is the return of his father's greatsword Ice to Robb's hand at Riverrun. Once again, I think that's a very normal term. I think so far, if this was the terms as of right now, this would be accepted. But I think as it goes on, Robb leans into the much more controversial terms. But Catelyn reflects on her past decisions in Book 1, because if you think about why Ned went south, it was mainly because of Catelyn and Luwin, I guess, right? Both of them. Whereas in the show, you also have Catelyn who says, don't go, Ned, and all that stuff. In the book, it's different. Catelyn pushes Ned to go south for their family's position and for kind of power and things like that, the honor of the house, and that's what kind of makes Ned go south. And so when you think about Catelyn in this way, she's going to feel a lot of that guilt and all of that stuff. Now, I don't think that she is entirely guilty for what happened to Ned, but I think a lot of her actions led to Ned's death, things that were out of Ned's control that were basically prompted because of Catelyn's actions. But she also then observes her brother Edmure, who stands silently with a stern expression. And it seems quite clear that Edmure is not the biggest fan of offering peace terms to the Lannisters. And I can't necessarily, fault him, right? There's a lot of emotion going on right now. But I think that peace is the correct route for the Starks. But that'll get us into page 84. I actually forgot to put up 83 for the first part of the term. So basically what page 83 was when Robb starts to give the terms. Robb then continues listing his terms. His fourth term, Queen Cersei must command Lord Tywin to release the Northmen, knights, and lords captured at the Battle of the Green Fork. In exchange, Robb will release his own captives, except for Jaime Lannister, who will remain a hostage to ensure Tywin's compliance. So basically what Robb is doing is he's doing what Ned and Robert did to the Greyjoys by taking Theon as a hostage to make sure that Baelon didn't rebel. And it doesn't work here because I think, Robb is in a position of strength, right? He's the one winning all the victories. The Lannisters desperately need, to defend against either Stannis or Renly. They just right now do not have the forces to be everywhere at once. And so the Starks do have a lot of leverage. But again, this is never going to be accepted. You have to give up Jaime. And I know Robb doesn't want to because of what Jaime's done, right? He's killed a lot of important people. He's viewed as this kinslayer, horrible person, one of the most horrible people in this, world. But if you're going to make peace, Jaime has to be freed. That's just something that has to happen. And if that can't happen, then there will be no peace. But after this term, Catelyn notices Theon Greyjoy's sly smile, which she finds unsettling, which is quite weird, right? You think Theon would be kind of alarmed by this, right? Because of what he has experienced in his own life. He's basically playing the role of someone like Jaime, or even if you look at some of the stuff he's going to ask for Lord Tywin and all that stuff, he's going to ask for like hostages, more or less. And so Theon should feel quite uncomfortable hearing a lot of this, but he doesn't really seem to, always smiling and still showing the young kind of man that he is. But the final term is King Joffrey and Queen Cersei must renounce all claims to the north, which will become a free and independent kingdom. The new northern domain will include all Stark lands and territories north of the Neck, as well as areas around the River Trident. And this gets, an uproar from the great Jon saying the King of the North and all that, but these terms just are not going to be accepted, right? There's no real compromise that Robb is making. This is kind of like a treaty where you've already beaten the Lannisters, and this is just kind of your terms of what's going to occur. It's not something that can be accepted. Jaime is not going to be freed, and also you're removing a good majority of the kingdoms. This is just never going to be accepted. And I think Robb even knows that, but at least if you're in Catelyn's position, it's a start, right? And then Robb begins to then specify where the new borders are going to be and what's going to be occurring with a new northern kingdom. He specifies that Lord Tywin must withdraw his forces and stop all hostile actions. The Iron Throne will make no claims to taxes or services from the north. Northern lords and knights will be released from any oaths or debts to the Iron Throne, House Baratheon, or House Lannister. And lastly, the Lannisters must provide 10 highborn hostages as a pledge of peace to be released gradually over time. It was going to be 2 captives per year. So it would basically be like a 5-year hostage situation, which actually is quite lenient. Like, that's actually a pretty good hostage like situation for the side that's the losing side. But again, you have to assume that if these terms are going to be accepted, the Lannisters are getting beat down. And that just is not the case at this point. Tywin would never accept this, nor will Cersei. Robb then throws the rolled parchment at Sir Cleos's feet. Again, just being very disrespectful. And so I feel really bad for Cleos. Like, even though he fought for the Lannisters, like, he doesn't need to be treated like somebody, less than him. But yeah. But he says that if the terms are not met, he will bring war once again. And the others begin chanting for the King of the North once again, while Grey Wind howls. Sir Cleos, who is visibly shaken by this, agrees to deliver the message to the Queen. Robb then instructs Sir Robin Ryger to provide Sir Cleos with a meal and clean clothes for his departure at first light, and the meeting then concludes with Robb leaving the hall, followed by Grey Wind, as the assembled lords kneel. Catelyn and her brother, Edmure, walk out together. So this kind of ends this meeting, and like I've talked about, I think with Robb in these terms, it's a start to a possible peace, but there's a long way to go, right? I've already talked about some of the things that just would never be allowed. If there was to be a peace, this is what would have to happen, right? It would have to be Jaime's getting returned for the girls. It would have to be that the North and the Riverlands are still part of the kingdoms. That all that stuff would have to still occur, and right now we're just not in that position to actually have these terms be accepted. But Catelyn does compliment Robb on his performance, but she criticizes Robb for being a boy, right? She's flaunting Grey Wind, at Cleos Frey for kind of like showmanship, for entertainment. And again, it shows that he's still a boy. He still is not this man. He's only 15 years old. He still hasn't really grown up. And Robb is more amused by this, mentioning, Cleos's face to the reaction of the direwolf. But Catelyn points out other things that were going on. Lord Karstark walking out of this meeting, it shows that some of the people or the lords don't agree with Robb's decision to do some sort of peace, even if it is a really bad peace treaty. Robb removes his crown and gives it to Oliver to return to his bedchamber, and Edmure totally expresses frustration as well on talking with peace with the Lannisters as they ravage their lands, arguing they should be marching on Harrenhal now. And Edmure, to me, is not very wise, and Edmure is acting out of emotion, something Catelyn will do quite a lot as well. But at this time, if they marched on Harrenhal, the Lannisters would easily defeat the Starks. It's just not even close. If they even tried to attack Harrenhal, they would be killed. And that's something like even Roose Bolton knows. Like, the only way you're going to take Harrenhal without dragons is going to be through some sort of trickery, which Arya is involved in when we see that change hands. And so you really see that Catelyn is kind of right. There should be a peace being made, not marching to Harrenhal. And Robb even knows they don't have the strength for attacking Harrenhal, which Edmure argues that sitting idle only weakens their host, as the River Lords leave to defend their own lands. And Catelyn is right on the money to say, well, Edmure, you're the one who pushed for Robb to send all the River Lords back to defend their lands. And that's a really stupid thing to do, right? It's making your army way more split up once again. Edmure's already fallen for this once at the very beginning of the war, and now he does it again. Robb needs his host to be as strong as possible, and sending some of this strength, back to Seaguard, where they're of no use to anyone there, right? The Mallisters are not being threatened right now. There's no point of them going back to their, homeland. It's just stupid to me. And so I do think that Edmure is kind of in the wrong here. Edmure defends his stance, stating that the River Lords cannot be expected to do nothing while their lands are being pillaged, but expresses concern about losing the support of Lord Karstark, a Northman. Again, showing that we need to make him happy. He does control a lot of Robb's strength. But the thing I look at that is like, yes, in theory, your lords should be protecting your small folk, your peasants, but in a time of war, and the war that Tywin is playing, it is not a smart decision to do those things. You're playing right into what Tywin wants you to do. And Robb even agrees. He knows he has to speak to Lord Karstark, acknowledging that he has lost a lot, losing 2 sons in battle, and may not be inclined to seek peace with the killers of his family and Robb's father. Because Robb, even himself, doesn't really want to do peace. He seems to be coerced into it. Because Catelyn says and reiterates what she said in Book 1 during the King of the North chapter, that further bloodshed will not bring back their loved ones, and suggests that Robb's peace terms could have been more appealing. And I 100% agree with Catelyn. If you actually wanted a peace, you would have given them something that you knew could possibly lead to it being accepted. But Robb argues that that wasn't possible, right? He wouldn't give them any sweeter terms. He couldn't stomach that. But the other part of it is also not only Robb, but it's what do his lords want? The people that made him king of the North, what do they want? They don't want peace. They made that very clear when they made Robb king. They want to continue the war and to avenge Ned and all their lost and all of their loved ones. And Catelyn even reflects on Robb's desire for vengeance and his struggles with the responsibilities of kingship, noting his youthful appearance despite his attempts to look older with a beard. Robb really strikes me in this chapter as somebody that is trying to be older than he is. And I think we can all understand that. I think there's a time in all of our lives where, we were growing up and we thought we didn't need, our parents all the time around us, and we were wanting to be self-dependent and all these things and grow up faster. That's where Robb is. He's somebody that's trying to grow up, and that becomes really even more apparent as we get further into this chapter. Catelyn doubts that Cersei will agree to exchange Robb's sisters for her cousins, pointing out that she will demand Jaime's release instead. Again, it's just a completely different power level, right? If you think about the Stark girls, right, even if they had Arya, these are people that are direct, sisters to the king or daughters of Catelyn, whereas these cousins don't have that much sway. And so Jaime Lannister really is the prisoner that you would have to give up to get Sansa or Arya back, and Catelyn knows that. And Catelyn had had this talk with Robb before, it seems like, but he would never listen. As seldom do kings really listen to counsel like her son, Robb, used to. That'll get us into page 86. And this is something that I talk about with like young Griff going into Winds of Winter, is I think, you give somebody a crown and how does that change them? How does the power, being the person that has overall power, you are the person that can dictate all of the policies, all the things going on, how does that change you? And Robb even insists that he cannot release Jaime Lannister even if he wanted to, as his lords would not tolerate it. And he's completely right. If he released Jaime Lannister, his lords would rebel against him, more than likely. Now, I do want to point this out, though. If Robb was getting a peace, and the Northmen got to go home, they were done with this war, because of the peace Robb, did with trading Jaime for his sisters, I think people wouldn't have been as much in an outrage as when Catelyn does it, as when the war is going quite poorly, is when Catelyn decides to release Jaime, not in the position to end the war, but just to get her daughters back. A really bad move, and there's a little bit of a difference here. But Catelyn argues against this, saying that the lords made them his king. Sometimes he needs to, make the hard decisions, and they can't unmake him. But I disagree. The people that crown you can also uncrown you. And that's something Catelyn's going to find out in A Storm of Swords. The Freys are sworn to Robb, the Boltons are sworn to Robb, the Karstarks are sworn to Robb, but all three of those will either leave him or actually turn on him at the Red Wedding. And so Catelyn just doesn't see that. She even warns Robb that many of his lords would want to kill Jaime, and if he dies while imprisoned, Cersei would retaliate against the Stark sisters, who would retaliate against Sansa and Arya. And that is true, but I think it's a bit different here, right? I talk about this as well. Trying to break into the Riverrun cells is much more difficult than what happens in the show, where it's like he's just in some random cage. It's pretty easy to break him out and kill him, or break him out or kill him. So I don't think that this is necessarily warranted here, but Catelyn does have a worry, right? If she doesn't want to lose more of her family already. And Robb reassures Catelyn that Jaime is being well treated and that no one is allowed to speak to him without Robb's permission, but he remains adamant that he will not free Jaime, not even for his sister. And Catelyn is kind of shocked by this, right? Because if he is not willing to do it now, when will that ever occur, right? Because even if Robb wins this war, the Lannisters will just kill Sansa or Sansa and Arya whenever they get close to King's Landing. There really is not a lot of hope for them at this point. But Catelyn then reflects on how Robb has kind of matured once again, wondering if it's due to the war or the weight of the crown. But she takes one more step that I think a little out of bounds. She crosses that line. She questions if Robb is afraid to face Jaime in battle again. And I don't think Robb is necessarily afraid of having to outsmart and beat Jaime in a contest, like in a war, in a battle, like outsmarting him. But I think Robb would be wise to not want to take him on in single combat. Jaime is one of the best fighters, if not the best, of this time. He would be foolish to do that. And Grey Wind, almost in response to Robb's, emotion, growls as Robb becomes angry. And Edmure tries to comfort Catelyn. Again, he agrees with Robb's stance. But I think Catelyn went over the line. I think she's trying to provoke Robb to do something, and that isn't really what he should be doing. Robb then angrily tells Edmure not to call him a boy, asserting his status as a grown man and a king. He declares he does not fear Jaime, whom he has already defeated once. And I think that is somewhat true for Robb. I don't think Robb, fears Jaime in battle, but I do think that one thing that I do think is very clear, Robb is very insecure about being called a boy, right? That seems to trigger some sort of emotion in him, as again, he wants to be viewed as a man, as growing up and all of those things. And Robb even admits that Jaime might have been traded for their father, but not for his sisters. Again, it shows the difference in status between male and female, of how they're valued in the society, which unfortunately places more value on males. And Catelyn even calls that out, but Robb seems visibly hurt by her words. And she doesn't, want to do that to Robb, but it is kind of the truth, right? Robb is saying that he won't trade Jaime Lannister for, his sisters. That is showing that he feels like they are not as important. And Robb's just in a tough position because he can't both please his mother and his lords. He has to pick a stance, and what he internally feels is usually not what Catelyn wants. And Catelyn even regrets this, feeling overwhelmed by grief and fear for her daughters and, the pain of losing, not only her father who's about to die, but also her husband, Ned. Robb assures her that he will do everything he can for Arya and Sansa, but adds that if Cersei refuses his terms, he will make her regret it, signaling an end to the conversation. Yeah, Robb just doesn't want to talk about this anymore. I think, you think about Robb, who's trying to figure out how to win this war because he knows these peace terms aren't going to be accepted. He's in quite a tough spot because the Lannisters, which he doesn't know at this point, but the Lannisters are about to have another army once again. He's in a really rough spot. He needs to do some sort of action. He can't sit still. The more that he stays in one spot, the more kind of unrest the Stark host has. Because remember, the Starks are really on the offense, right? The Lannisters want to play defense. They want to kind of spread the Stark forces, thin and beat them at a battle that Tywin wants to choose the position of. But getting into page 87, Robb suggests that Catelyn go to the Twins, where she would be safer and could meet Lord Frey's daughters to help him choose a bride after the war. And this is the point where we get to it, right? Robb wants to send his mother away. He doesn't like his mother kind of always being on his back and kind of being, there with him all the time because he's kind of insecure. If you think about when you were younger, teenage years or whatever, you didn't want to be seen with your, parents in public or something. That was something that people would bully you about, which is so ridiculous when you really think about it. Really stupid. You're with your family, having a good time. Who cares? But that's kind of where Robb is at right now. He's a 15-year-old, boy trying to project that he's a man and he's worthy of the crown that he's been given. But also, Catelyn is usually disagreeing with Robb in a lot of the things he's doing. And Catelyn even realizes that Robb wants her gone, but she declines, saying that Robb is old enough to choose his own bride. Robb then proposes that she should accompany Theon to Seaguard and then sail to Winterfell to be with Bran and Rickon. And if you're Catelyn, it's got to be very heartbreaking, right? That your son is trying to send you away. But not only that, it reveals something interesting, that Theon is going to Pike. He's going to negotiate with Balon Greyjoy. And Catelyn right here, this is her moment where she should tell Robb about Ned's kind of last wishes to her, and unfortunately she fails at that again. But Catelyn also suggests that her place is with her dying father at Riverrun. And Robb, attempting to assert his authority, hints could command her to go as a king, but Catelyn ignores the suggestion. Catelyn is Robb's mother. You're not going to order around her like a king. It's just not how that relationship's going to go, and Robb knows that. But Catelyn instead goes to the idea of Theon going to Pike. She says that he should send somebody else to negotiate with him, whether that be any of these other lords, Titus Blackwood or Bracken, or even, Stevron Frey gets brought up in the conversation, who I think would be a great negotiator for them. Robb kind of doesn't agree with this, as he defends Theon, recounting how he saved Bran from wildlings and argues that Balon's longships would be more easily secured with Theon's help. And again, Robb thinks of Theon as a brother, right? But Theon, I want you to think about him as a person. I made it really clear in book 1 all of the times in which Robb or the Starks made Theon feel less than. If you think about even that part that he just mentions, how Theon saved Bran's life, Robb was extremely upset with Theon and trying to put him basically in his place in book 1. A lot of those things are going to come up here in this book specifically, starting one of my favorite plot lines of A Clash of Kings and Theon's. But this is a terrible idea, because Catelyn counters this with saying Theon is a hostage. It is a safer way of ensuring that the Greyjoys don't attack the north, because Theon is Balon's last remaining male heir. And even if you think about the histories, Balon is very treacherous. He went against Robb's father Ned in the Greyjoy rebellion that happened not so long ago. And Robb asserts that who cares? If he's the king of the north, why should Balon not be the king of the Iron Islands? Provided that Balon fights, the Lannisters, who cares? Robb would just give a crown to Balon. And that's the key difference that Robb doesn't understand about the Greyjoy culture. You don't just give someone a crown. And Robb ends this conversation. He dismisses Catelyn's concerns and departs with Grey Wind, signaling the end of the discussion. And this is where Catelyn should have brought up that Ned specifically told her to tell Robb and all of the other Northmen to keep Theon close. She fails to sway Robb against this course that is extremely stupid. Catelyn once again sees the transformation of her son from a child to a king. But she abruptly decides to visit her dying father, Hoster Tully, and invites her brother, Edmure, to join her. And Edmure declines, preoccupied with training new bowmen, revealing, once again, his discomfort of his ailing father. And I can't blame Edmure here. If you think about what's going on, you're having to watch as your father gets weaker and weaker and closer to dying. You're not going to want to, see that, right? It's something that's going to be very difficult to see. As someone who had a grandmother that, passed away due to, dementia and all those things, it became very difficult to be around her. And that's not to say I didn't love my grandmother, but she became someone that was not my grandmother. And so it was very hard to see her in that regard. And I see why Edmure would want to enjoy that, to distract his mind of losing his father. But that gets us into page 88. Catelyn takes the shortest path to the central keep where her father, Hoster Tully, is dying. She passes through the Godswood, which remains lush and green despite the arrival of autumn. Declared by the conclave with the arrival of the White Raven, the trees have yet to shed their leaves, unaware of the season's change. It just doesn't look like summer's over yet, but it soon will. Catelyn reflects on the significance of autumn, recognizing it as a very fearful time, with the threat of winter looming and uncertainty about future harvests. And that's the crucial part of it. The Riverlands are being set afire, right? All the crops, all of the food that is trying to be built up and saved for the winter is gone. It's looking very dire if you think about the situation, and this is why it's so key that the War of the Five Kings happens when it does. She arrives at her father's solar, in which she sees Lord Hoster Tully lying in his bed, weakened and frail, with his hair and beard now white. But she finds her uncle, who has just now returned, and Blackfish informs Catelyn that he has not yet spoken to Robb, having come directly to Lord Hoster himself. It shows, his priorities, right, of being there with his brother, through the last moments of his life. He intends to share his news with Robb privately before any public court announcement. Makes a lot of sense, right? Before Robb makes any declaration of what they're going to do moving forward, you want to discuss those things in private first. But Blackfish asks more on how his brother is doing, how is Hoster doing, and Catelyn gives kind of the bad news, right? That he is still someone mostly asleep with dream wine and milk of the poppy for his pain. His health is declining each day, with his appetite diminishing and his strength fading. He describes his father's speech, noting that he speaks less coherently, often mixing up past and present, talking of regrets, unfinished tasks, and people who have long passed away. He sometimes struggled to recognize even Catelyn herself, and once mistakenly called her by her mother's name. Again, it's somebody losing not only their physical strength, but their mental strength. Again, like I talked about with my grandmother, very similar to kind of what Hoster is going through. Maybe she didn't have as much issues in terms of maybe her physical strength. It was more, her mind was going. But I really feel for Catelyn. It's really heartbreaking to watch someone you care about lose their ability to, live. And, any death, that's close to you is very, hard to deal with. But you have kind of the opposite of spectrum sometimes, right? Where Ned's death, if you think about it, was very sudden and was a shocking death, whereas Hoster's just a slow, decline that is someday going to happen. but is that person even going to be recognizable? That's kind of how I had with both my grandparents. My grandfather died very suddenly. It was a shock. He was a very healthy man, and then the next day, he was gone. My grandmother was the opposite. So it just shows kind of how life is. The Blackfish comments that Hoster still misses his late wife, and that Catelyn bears a strong resemblance to her, especially in her cheekbones and jawline. And Catelyn acknowledges that her uncle remembers her mother better than she does, given the many years that have passed. She expresses her anxiety about her father's health, revealing that each time she returns from a ride, she wonders if she will find him alive or dead. Despite past quarrels, there remains a deep bond between Hoster and Brynden, even though Hoster once disowned his brother. A very complex relationship between Hoster and Brynden, but this is still family that you're talking about. And you think about all the good times that Blackfish would have had with his brother, even through, some of maybe the bad times. But that gets us into page 89. Catelyn and Brynden sit in silence for a little while, until Catelyn raises her head, recalling that he mentioned tidings Robb needs to hear. She wants to hear the gossip before Robb hears it. And Hoster Tully seems to almost understand this as he moans and rolls onto his side. And this prompts Blackfish to basically go somewhere else to discuss these things as to not wake him. But the news that Blackfish gives her is not good news. But they go to the stone balcony that extended from the solar, and they both kind of gaze up at the comet. Once again, every chapter does this, but they describe what the red comet looks like to them. Brynden himself refers to it as a red messenger, and he questions the meaning of this omen. Catelyn recounts the different opinions that she's heard about it. The Great John had thought of it as the old gods unfurling a red flag of vengeance for Ned Stark, while Edmure sees it as a victory omen for Riverrun, interpreting it as a fish with a long tail and Tully colors. But Catelyn herself sees only the Lannister crimson. But Blackfish disagrees. The comet is not exactly crimson. The sky is more of a red, like in blood. And I think Brynden is kind of right on the money, right? The comet is, yes, to herald, Daenerys and magic coming back in the world, but also of death and blood to come. Catelyn questions whether the blood is theirs or that of the enemy, to which Brynden replies that wars involve both sides being bled. And that is the truth, right? War impacts everyone, not just, armies, but it affects the farmers and the people, the innocents of this world. And that's what Blackfish is going to talk about a lot because of the tidings that he's heard. He describes the current chaos in the Riverlands, highlighting the widespread blood and flames around the God Eye, with fighting spreading south to the Blackwater and north across the Trident, even nearing the Twins. Brynden mentions a couple small victories by Mark Piper and Carl Vance, as well as by Beric Dondarrion raiding against Lord Tywin's forces, but there's also a lot more bad in this. And Catelyn even thinks that, Ned had sent some of these men with Beric Dondarrion, that they are probably those same people, and hopes for their safety, which is interesting given Catelyn's, relationship with them later on. But yeah, Beric would definitely be viewed as a good force for the Tullys and the Starks. But Blackfish, noting the tales that have been told of Beric and his red priest Thoros, they have been pretty good at surviving if the tales are true. But Blackfish comments on how Robb had let the Riverlords go back to defend themselves in their own self-preservation. It was all for naught, right? They were all bloodying themselves for no reason. Blackfish tells of Jonas Bracken being wounded while defending his castle, and his nephew Hendry was slain. Tytos Blackwood had managed to push the Lannisters off his land, but lost everything. There was no resources, nothing to even protect anymore. All he had was a scorched Raventree Hall to defend. He reports that the Dairymen recaptured their lord's keep, but after less than 2 weeks, Gregor Clegane attacked and killed the entire garrison, including their lord. And Catelyn is horrified by this. All this violence going on in all these different parts of the Riverlands. It shows you they should have stayed together as an army and been able to actually deal with this enemy as a unit, not as separate, lords commanding and all these things, as things go terribly awry. And Catelyn notices that the Lord of Derry was only a child, and this leaves the Derry line in doubt, right? But that'll get us into page 90. And it's all these reasons of why Catelyn wants peace. All these people dying because of this war, and for what? That's the key point of this. George is telling us that this war is horrible. And Brynden even thinks it made more sense if Gregor Clegane would have kept the young Derry. He would have gotten a really nice ransom, but it's not about that. It's Gregor being told to send a message to the Tullys and the Starks, or even people that are undecided and just, sitting out of it. If you go against the Lannisters, this is what's going to happen. It's using a terror tactic to try and draw the Starks into a fight that they won't be able to win. Brynden wishes that they could make Gregor's head a noble gift for the realm, but also Brynden is smart. He doesn't want to go at the Lannisters at all, to go towards Harrenhal like Edmure and Robb kind of were thinking of. But this gets a reaction from Catelyn as she thinks about Ned's head that had been on a spike above the Red Keep for crows and flies to see. Joffrey's work, and it was horrible the way Ned has been treated after his death. Catelyn even struggles to believe that Ned is truly gone, sometimes waking in darkness, expecting him to be beside her. And this is the hardest part, I think, especially as, you get older and, either you or your partner dies first. How does the other one cope with that? Living with someone for so long, being expected of so many things, it's a really tough situation. Sorry to keep bringing up my grandparents, but this is kind of the situation. My grandfather died first, and my grandmother very much relied on my grandfather. A very kind of traditional relationship of their time where my grandfather pretty much did everything for her, and so that was a real struggle when when he died. And that's kind of what Catelyn, I feel like, would be dealing with, right? How do you go on when you've leaned on Ned for so many years? She declares that Clegane is merely a tool of Lord Tywin Lannister, the real danger behind the current chaos, which is the truth. And Blackfish even adds that Tywin is no fool. He is currently safe behind the walls of Harrenhal while taking advantage of the Riverlands' harvests and burning what he cannot use. It's scorched earth tactics. I'm not going to let you get this food. I'm not going to let you resupply yourself. I'm going to wait you out. I'm going to bring your morale down because it's more detrimental to you than it is to me. He warns that Gregor is not the only threat, though, as Tywin has also unleashed new animals to the Riverlands. Sir Amory Lorch, who Arya is going to encounter at some point, and also a sellsword. So these are big things for Blackfish to talk about because they're going to have a huge role in the upcoming story. But he describes the atrocities left in their wake, including burned villages, raped and mutilated women, and butchered children left unburied. How horrifying. And Catelyn even knows that the response to this won't be good. It'll be rage. Edmure, somebody that cares about his small folk quite a lot, will want action. And Blackfish counters. That's the exact thing that Tywin wants. Tywin wants them to meet them in an open field where Tywin chooses the battlefield like he tried to do with the Battle of the Green Fork. Tywin is doing that to provoke them to battle. And Catelyn expresses her concern. Robb is restless, and others will push him to try and fight, especially after his recent victories against Jaime, as they viewed him as like a Aegon the Conqueror type. And Blackfish warns her that it would be foolish to give the enemy what he wants, noting that Tywin wants them to attack Harrenhal soon. Tywin wants to deal with Robb, and the best way to do that is to make Robb come to him. That prompts Catelyn to think on Harrenhal, a vast fortress built by King Harren the Black beside the God's Eye. 300 years ago, during a time when the Seven Kingdoms were divided and ruled by the Iron Men from the islands. And that'll get us into page 91, but we're going to get quite a lore dump onto Harrenhal and how it came to be, and why it has such a bad reputation. It took King Harren 40 years to construct Harrenhal, during which time his armies plundered the surrounding lands for resources like stone, lumber, and labor. Basically, Harren took the Riverlands and a lot of the land that he controlled, and he used their populations to basically do slave labor into building his castle, this monstrosity that took 40 years to build. It was King Harren's legacy. Thousands of captives were perished while working on the fortress, enduring harsh conditions year-round. Weirwoods, ancient trees were cut down to provide material for the construction. Very Tolkien-esque description, because these are trees that had been there forever, right? It's destroying the natural beauty of these areas, and that's why I think a lot of the old gods would be quite angry with the South. And maybe we'll see more of that come through in Bran's plotline in the Winds of Winter. Just a horrible thing that Harren did. But on the day that Harrenhal was completed, King Aegon the Conqueror arrived in Westeros, and it seemed only natural to take the greatest castle ever made in Westeros to go against the dragons. Catelyn recalled Old Nan's story, which concludes with the lesson that high walls offer no protection against dragons that can fly, as Harren and his lineage were destroyed by fire when Aegon unleashed his dragons on the fortress. It just shows how powerful dragons are, and also it shows how powerful Harrenhal is. If you don't have dragons, How do you take Harrenhal? It is one of the most defensible castles in Westeros. It is a huge castle that has a really big defensible position. How would you even siege it? It'd be a very tough thing to do. It's all to kind of build up this allure of why Robb should very much avoid Harrenhal. But not only that, Harrenhal has a very bad reputation. It seems to be a dark and cursed place, bringing misfortune to any who hold it. She recounts that every family that has held Harrenhal has had a pretty horrible fate. Catelyn expresses her desire to avoid having Robb fight near Harrenhal, acknowledging the need for action against the Lannisters. And that's the issue you come to, right? Is you need to do action, but how do you attack your enemy if they're playing a very defensive war that you cannot take it to them on? That's the major issue that Catelyn is kind of realizing. But Brynden reveals even more bad, as in the west from Casterly Rock, a new Lannister army is gathering. He informs her that Sir Stafford Lannister will command this new host, noting that he is an old man and somewhat dull, but his son, Sir Daven, is more formidable. And we've even seen Sir Daven with Jaime in A Feast for Crows. He is quite formidable, and actually a very likable Lannister. Hopefully he doesn't die in a potential wedding in the next book in Winds of Winter, but doesn't look great for him. But yeah, it's a huge threat because you have already Robb is undermanned in terms of fighting Tywin, but there's also going to be a war on two fronts, a war in the west and a war in the south for Robb. What is he going to do? Catelyn then places her hopes on Sir Stafford leading the army rather than his son. And Brynden reassures her that there is still time before they must confront this army. As you got to think, right? Jaime and Tywin both just brought hosts from the west. How do they have this new host? And it's a lot of fresh recruits. It's a lot of untrained men, a lot of farmers, peasants, people that are looking for food where they can't find any. It's, the desperate. It's a desperate army, really. And so they're going to have to be able to train that army and get them armored up before they try and do some war against a very hardened Northern and Riverland coalition. But once that happens, right, once they cross into the Riverland area, Robb will have to split his forces. He'll have to decide what will he do. And if he doesn't act quickly, he'll be caught between two large armies. And Blackfish even says that, right? Lord Tywin Lannister is not reckless like Jaime. He will wait for Sir Stafford to march before making any move. And Catelyn speculates that Tywin might leave Harrenhal to face another threat, prompting Brynden to ask her to elaborate. And Catelyn is hinting at, again, this idea that there are other forces in Westeros right now that don't like the Lannisters. There's this rumblings of Stannis in the east and Renly to the south. If he gets called off, that would be a really big help for the Starks. It would allow pressure to be put off of the Riverlands and for Robb to take the war to the Lannisters. As we get into the last page, Blackfish considers the possibility of seeking help from Renly, referring to him as Lord Renly. But Catelyn corrects him, just like Great John did earlier on. Renly has declared himself a king, acknowledging that if she were to ask for assistance, she would need to grant him the title he has claimed. Catelyn is already figuring out what needs to happen. Robb needs an ally. Robb needs somebody to take away the Lannisters from their area. And the Blackfish seems to pick up what Catelyn's putting down, indicating that Renly will have demands for any support. And Catelyn acknowledges that what Renly will want is homage, the recognition and loyalty typically expected from those seeking a king's aid. And so the plan's already set in motion, right? That Catelyn needs to go and get allies, and we need to open up another front. Something we see like in World Wars all the time. The best way to defeating your enemy is make them stretched, make them being attacked from multiple areas. But yeah, that is the chapter. I really love Catelyn 1 in A Clash of Kings. It really sets the stage for this book extremely well. But I hope you guys all enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.